All right. Welcome to the Quizzical Spirit podcast. I'm Ross,
And I'm Deb Heim.
and today we're talking about beginnings, starting books that are not the first in the series.
Yeah.
And you know, uh, we when we started the podcast, we said we were going to talk a lot about how we developed Ostera, which is the novel that we're working on. And to be
One
honest,
of the
it,
novels that we're working on, because we're working on two. We're always working on at least two.
right. Uh, it hasn't taken a lot of work. I mean, I think we had a pretty good idea of how it was going to work. We had one
You
issue
mean
we had to figure.
Ostera?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we had one
true.
issue we had to figure out how to add some threat and tension. Once we
Which
figured
we
that
did.
out, the rest of the book just sort of kind of fell together. So it's going to be a really good book. But um, you know, in all stories that are not the very first story, well, in all books, the very beginning of the book is really important. I mean, the first story in a series has to kind of set the mood, and um,
I
and
think that's
so
the case. Honestly, I think that's the case for all books. You need to get grabbed.
yeah,
Historically, if we look at older fiction, um, books that we read 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago,
yeah,
um, they
like
moved a lot slower
right,
because there were no other alternative entertainments and distractions like there are now. I firmly believe that. Like
yeah.
there was TV, three channels, like
Well, but I
you
mean, if you go beyond that, I mean, if you ever tried to read Les Miserables, the beginning of the book when he's just walking towards this town, it just goes on forever and ever, right?
yeah, I read a short story, The Beast in the Jungle, that I had read in high school, 16 years old, and I loved it. And I reread it in my 50s. And I'm like, oh my God. So it isn't like I read dense stuff. I was an English major. I read really dense stuff, and I don't know what's changed other than
Well, but
social
would
media.
you read those even back then? Would you read those if you weren't required to read them?
That's not nerdy. I mean, but I was an English major, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I reread Pride and Prejudice like 5 times. Nobody made me do that.
Yeah, Pride and
Um,
Prejudice is a little bit different. It doesn't quite start the same way as a book like Les Mis. It jumps right into,
yeah,
uh,
the social
the
stuff.
yeah, right. But I mean, nowadays there's many other types of entertainment that has to grab you pretty quickly, and there are many books, millions of books published every year.
Most of which suck, but
Right, and so
that's a
people,
separate issue.
there's the shorthand DNF did not finish, right? And so if you don't grab people right away,
Right.
um, they get bored. And to be honest, a couple of reviewers had said something like that about Argon Blue. Like they
Mhm.
felt like it started slow. I don't know how they can say that, but you know what? That's people's perception. Now,
Right.
those people who have left reviews and said that it's definitely worth it once you get into it. It's
Yes.
a really kind of intricate story that has a big payoff. But so when we start a book that's not the first in the series, then the question is, how do we do that?
Right.
Um,
How much do you do? You cannot do a data dump. You cannot do a redo of the other book. The assumption, if you're a fantasy reader, is one of two things. You either have read the previous books and you're jumping into this, or you're willing to accept a certain level of ambiguity with the understanding that there's an entire story, an entire novel before this that you didn't read and chose not to read.
mhm. Yeah, and you know, if you're reading a trilogy, you accept that, and Spirit Song, which is a trilogy, um, you you're
It's a
going to accept.
series. We call it a series.
Right. Um, but the prequel books uh, don't say trilogy on them. They
No,
um, they are a series of books that happen chronologically, but they don't. They're not labeled as a trilogy, and the
right.
reason for that is to you know help alleviate the confusion between the actual
It's
trilogy.
worked beautifully up to this
Yeah.
point.
Well, we have a timeline on the website, and we're going to start
We
putting the
do.
timeline in the book so people kind of understand what happens when.
Yeah, because it's
Um,
okay. Because here's the big issue. This is not just a world. It is one gigantic storyline over 12 books.
yeah, and it's very intricately woven together. So um, if you can read the trilogy all by itself, and if you
Mhm.
do that, you get the maximum reveals in terms of plot
Right,
twists. Um, or if you read the prequels, you'll have kind of an understanding of how things got to be where they were when the sequel the trilogy
the
started.
trilogy.
The prequel started 10 years before, and the main issue is this woman Reagan, who is the woman who sort of is manipulating the whole thing. And how does she do that?
And
Um,
why does she do it?
right. So if you start the prequels first and you read all of those, you won't have the plot twists in the trilogy. But the thing is, sometimes it's kind of more interesting to know more than the characters know.
Right.
Um, so that is a way to go. Um, on the website, I have kind of a sequence of books to read it so that you get the plot twist, but you also then have sort of the background so that you interweave the trilogy and the
Right.
prequels. But that may be more complicated than most people want to do it. So I would recommend reading the prequels first and then reading the
And
trilogy.
here's the other piece. They haven't all been written yet.
That's true.
So
Right.
so
Yeah.
we have folks who've read the Spirit Sight Volume 1, Spirit Sight Volume 2, have read Argren Blue, and are some of our ARC readers for Desultai and Spirit Light Book 2, Volume 1. And they're, waiting for the next books. Ostera should, but that's the thing. The next two books, Desultai and Spirit Light Book 2, Volume 1, they're coming out in August and November. So, I mean, we have to depend on our publisher. For those
Yeah.
of you who do want an advanced reader copy and are willing to leave an honest review, hit us up. And, we're always willing to share an early copy for those folks who are willing to leave an honest review.
Mhm.
But if you're waiting for the book to drop, my mother is like my mother keeps saying, "You have to finish it before I die." And she's 87.
Yeah.
She's not dying anytime soon, but we're like humping it pretty hard,
Yeah.
actually.
I know we're turning out these books pretty fast, but the thing is, we are subject to our publisher's calendar. They
Yes.
have a lot of other authors that they're publishing, and for example, Argent Blue is the first prequel. That's followed by Desultai, which comes out next November. The book Ostera is actually a parallel book to Desultai, and they actually share some scenes.
Yes,
So
but from different characters'
different points
perspectives.
of view,
Right.
right? But that book, I don't know when it's going to be finished. Probably in another month or so. And then
Well, who
we
knows
submit
when
it to our
that's gonna come
publisher,
out.
and yeah, and who knows when that gets on their calendar. So that is for those authors out there. That is one of the advantages of being self-published. You can publish it as soon as it's ready,
Right.
and you know uh, that is an advantage. But in terms of starting those books, you want people to be able to pick up a book especially in the prequels, and read it as is without having to read the previous books. And
Right.
so you have to, there are two parts of that. One is that you have to weave in within the story what happened before,
Mhm.
so that people aren't kind of left, wondering what the heck is going on.
And even
Um,
folks who have books that aren't a continuous plot like we have, they have continuous characters and
mm,
continuous, I'm reading, a series right now where the stories are discrete, but the characters and their relationships with each other are continuing, and so there have to be drops in that
right.
so that you understand their relationships.
Yeah, and also, uh, like Deb read Spirit Light Volume One a while back, and today she read the first scene that I wrote in Spirit Light Volume Two, and she's like, "I have no idea what's going on."
Yeah, I know, and I
Because
kinda
it's been a
knew.
while. It's been
Right,
a
I
while.
kinda knew, but it was still
Right.
not. Yeah, and here's the other piece with these books that's awesome and yet complicated. They're not. Most of the books I've read that are in a series follow a very particular pattern. Blah, 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 and I know what's gonna happen. It's just how it's gonna happen and what little nuance of it, but it has a story arc and a character. The characters develop to a certain point, but there's not a huge story arc for different characters. They're discrete, chunkable books. This is not that. There
Mhm.
is world building that happens between books. There is world building that happens as a result of short stories that are separate from the books. And like one of the books has a lot of battles in it because that's what's needed to move the story forward for that one. And then there are others that have to do with things like commerce. There are others that have to do with, so there's all social commentary in all of them. There's all about um, caste systems and things like that, the
Yeah. You
overarching
have
stuff.
an oppressive regime, and then you
Yes,
have a kind of sparsely populated agrarian people, and how do those people
fight back
overthrow the suppressive regime? And so there's a lot of historical references and how
yep,
revolutions have happened in the past, and there's a lot of aspects to that. And
a
there's the
lot,
military aspects and the social and the economic. So each of the books deals with different parts of that.
right,
Um, so it's a fairly complicated story, but it's based on real things. And
yes,
but one of the things that really came out in Spirit Light Volume One is this um, reliance on storytelling. Right. This is the
yeah,
Alios are an agrarian people.
yeah,
They had a written language in the past, but the empire wiped that out, and so they're basically have an oral tradition, and they rely on storytelling. And so the storytelling plays a big part in a lot of the books, and so a lot of the books have a prequel that have that storytelling theme
yes,
that kind of gives you an idea of what's happened before. So, for example, when I had to break Spirit Sight into two books, Spirit Sight Volume One and Volume Two, the beginning, at the Spirit Sight Volume One, kind of ended with things in the air, and Spirit Sight Volume Two jumped right into things. So I created a prologue in Spirit Sight Volume Two that takes place 10 years after all of the events of all of the saga, where you're in a small tavern in a tiny village somewhere in Argon, and someone's telling the story of what happened before.
right,
And so that kind of storytelling theme is what plays out. And for the prequels, there's a really important character that I'm not going to name, but he's critical to the overall story. And most of the prologues involve him
hmm,
at different parts of his life.
right,
So you get to kind of see how his life developed, why he ended up where he
where
did.
he ends up. And that will be our next podcast, which is the impact of storytelling on culture. I think that should
Yeah.
be our next podcast, right?
Okay,
Because
maybe. you know, we decide what the topics of the podcast are like right
that
before we
day,
go
right before,
on.
yeah. So maybe this is the next one. But anyway,
Yeah, we'll see.
I think yeah, we're good,
Yeah,
right?
15 minutes. Yeah. Right. So, um, bye.
Bye.